So hello, everyone. I am going to talk today about the 5 main areas to consider when deciding whether to start treatments for various behavioral concerns in X and Y variations. So the plan is to talk a little bit first about behavior differences and challenges that we see in some children and adults with X and Y variations, different treatments just in general. We're not going to talk about specific treatments, but just things to consider. And then the 5 main areas that I go through when I'm talking with families about whether or not we should initiate treatments. This includes behavioral treatments and medication treatments, primarily medication treatments, but really applies to any kind of therapies or other types of treatments as well. And then I will be available to take questions. So first, before we even get started, I like to use this slide to acknowledge that all kids and adults are different, right? While kids or adults may have the same X and Y variation, there's a big spectrum and a lot of differences within those. And so for a lot of these conditions, we will talk about being at risk for certain challenges or certain behaviors, but certainly not everybody with the conditions have the same level of challenges, if any challenges, in some of these areas. So just remember that everyone's unique, and that's really important to remember. Okay, so the way that I usually conceptualize a lot of this is that we know that there's a lot of risks for different developmental, cognitive, behavioral challenges in the X and Y variations. The X and Y variation itself is at the top. Those differences in the genes lead to differences in brain development and function, and again, at different levels for different people. And then leads to increased risk for various cognitive learning, developmental differences, social developmental differences that you can see all listed under here, and then also increased risk for different behavior and emotional difficulties in terms of attentional types of challenges, emotional differences, anxiety, depression, frustration tolerance, and then sometimes challenges with aggressive behaviors or obsessive compulsive behaviors. In general, again, there's increased risks in all of these. We do tend to see more challenges with development and cognitive functioning in kids who have more than one extra X or Y chromosome. So our XXYY boys, or any of the other conditions where there's extra X's and Y's beyond just that one extra. So the more differences there are in that genetic signature, more often there's more challenges across the different developmental and behavioral domains. However, again, very different between individuals. So first, just thinking about treatment options, like when we're going to talk about, well, when to consider treatments. Well, what do you mean by treatments? Well, treatments really could be anything, and for anyone can be very different. And I like to think about, a treatment pie, right? Where there are, there's not just one treatment for something, right? If someone's having challenges with anxiety, we're going to think about lots of different ways to help that. We're going to think about whether or not there's supports in the school or home setting that might be helpful. We're going to think about whether or not therapies might be helpful. We're going to think about whether medications might be helpful. And so we're really, the amount of contribution of each of those pieces, again, will be very different for each person. So, as a family member and as a medical provider or a therapist, you work together to help develop this treatment pie with all the different pieces of the treatment plan. The other piece is that, this pie and these treatments live on top of the base, right, of a family and home environment. And so it's really important to also think about, how the family and the child's home environment or environments fits into this so that it can be a stable base and the whole treatment pie doesn't just fall off, right? And so, we think about the individual child, and then we think about how we have to have, good support at home, good mental health and support for parents in terms of challenges that they're facing. And especially if there's more than one environment that the child lives in, making sure that those environments are coordinated so that the treatments can be applied and helping in the most positive way. So when should treatments be considered? Like, what is the idea of when should we do this? Well, in general, the big term here is when the behavior or the symptom is causing impairment, right? Causing challenges. For any types of symptoms, there's always some of these things that may happen typically in the general population, right? And in everybody at different degrees. So attention problems, we all have problems paying attention sometimes. It depends on the setting and it depends on how much impairments it's causing before we would call it an attentional disorder. Same thing with anxiety. Anxiety is a big spectrum. We all need some anxiety to get stuff done, right? But anxiety is not useful if the anxiety is so significant that it's impairing you from getting things done or allowing you to function. A lot of times I'm also asked, well, how frequently does it have to be causing impairment? And I mean, I think, again, that's very different for different people. Does it have to be something causing impairment multiple times per day across multiple settings? Sometimes maybe, but we also want to think about, sometimes if a child or adolescent is having big, huge temper tantrums or meltdowns that are causing impairment and problems every couple weeks, but they're still causing really big problems, well, then that's still causing impairment, right? It's probably leading to consequences from those big events that are less frequent that are causing challenges. So all of these will be things you think about with your providers and you talk about in terms of when are these symptoms causing difficulties. In terms of the timing, right, there's a big spectrum of when things can cause difficulties. Symptoms can be present, just being present, anxiety, like we talked about. Then it can be causing mild to moderate impairment or problems, moderate to severe problems, and then you end up in crisis, right, for some situations. When we're talking about developmental delays, I don't know that we get to crisis mode in terms of safety, but, there are, milder challenges, more significant challenges. Everyone's threshold for where they put that line is a little bit different. As a parent or caretaker, it's going to be different. As an individual having the symptoms, it's going to be different. And as a provider, it's going to be different. So the goal is to figure out where you are in terms of providing and initiating types of treatments. I would recommend you don't wait for crisis, right? If you're seeing that there's challenges, there's a lot of treatments and supports that can be happening before you end up in a crisis, where people are concerned about safety or injuries, where people are getting kicked out of certain settings, where people are being hospitalized. So, obviously we want to intervene before we get to crisis. My threshold has been really moving more and more towards when symptoms are present because of sometimes seeing those crises, right, that can be causing a lot of problems. So if we can see it coming or see that it may be a risk, let's make sure we're getting treatments before that. And then here, also just thinking about, we have a lot of families now that are getting a diagnosis early in the prenatal period, in infancy and childhood, or even if it's a later diagnosis, but about symptoms that are present or maybe the individual may be at risk for later, do we want to act proactively? And that's a whole other discussion, but I want to recognize and acknowledge that the idea of proactive treatments for the areas where kids and adults are at risk is really important. And so, so that's, like I said, a whole other talk, but there are some talks at this conference related to, supports and ways that you can support your infant and young child with speech development. And honestly, just being at this conference and learning about all these challenges is helping you in many ways from a proactive perspective. Okay, so when should treatments be considered? These are the top 5. When the behavior or symptom is causing impairment in health and safety, academics, learning, therapies, work, those settings where they're supposed to be, the individual is supposed to be productive, learning, working, social development and social interactions. We'll talk about that. Participation in the family and in the community. And then if the child or adult themselves are expressing or demonstrating distress about the behavior. So those are my top 5, and we're going to talk a little bit more about those. The first one is health and safety. Obviously, this is, an easier one to grasp. Yes, if the behavior or the challenge is causing challenge or, risk to health and safety, we want to think about it. But let's be a little bit more specific. So let's say there are injuries, obviously, injuries to self related to aggression or self-injurious behaviors. That is definitely an area where we want to intervene. Risk of injuries to self and others. So this, we think about aggression in those big areas, right? That obviously can cause risks to health and safety. But other things, like if you're just distractible or impulsive, right, those can also cause risks. If you're impulsive and running off, if you have attention difficulties and you are riding your bike and get distracted and crash into a car and be injured, if you're driving and you have attentional difficulties, if you forget to turn the stove off and you forget your keys all over the place. And then, those are all areas where you can imagine that there can be risks to safety and injuries that can occur. So those are important things to consider. If the behavior is also causing challenges with health, right? So, for example, if a child or adult is not growing well or not gaining weight because of, short attention span with meals or up and down all the time, they have really significant restrictions in terms of sensory symptoms, and they're not eating as much as they should, or they have a lot of anxiety issues related to food or the environment where they're supposed to eat, the cafeteria at school, or other settings where things are just too overwhelming to them. And then on the other way, if, symptoms are causing significant overeating and challenges related to obesity, and then subsequently to decreased activity and those other problems, then those are some of those situations where we really want to think about it. Obviously, if things are causing impairment with sleep is really important for all activities in the day, learning, work, emotional functioning and regulation. And so if anxiety is keeping kids up at night because they can't sleep, or other types of challenges like that, then we want to think about that. And then other things, like sometimes we'll have patients who will share stories of, he has challenges and doesn't want to poop at school or doesn't want to poop at the workplace. And so then because of, subsequent GI concerns or constipation, that can cause concerns related to health. So it's always important to think about, is there a clear risk to health and safety? Has an injury happened, or is there a risk for an injury or some health and safety concern happening related to this? Okay, number 2, academics, learning, therapies, work. So if the behavior is interfering with learning and academics, accessing therapies that they're already in, speech therapy, occupational therapy, being able to be productive at work. So thinking about, if someone is having attentional problems, how much time are the teachers or the therapists spending managing that attention, reining in the kid to pay attention compared to the amount of time that they're actually learning or benefiting from therapies, right? And so if you're spending all this time kind of convincing them, working with them, really trying to overcome the behavioral symptom, then it's going to decrease the efficacy of the, learning environment or the therapy environment, right? We want it to be a better balance as much as possible to be having them attend and able to access the therapies and the education coming to them. Thinking about, are they making the rate of progress that they're capable of in these academic or therapy environments, right? We know they have the potential to be here, but because of attention difficulties, they're here. Or because of anxiety and not going to school, they're here. Or because of anxiety and not going to work, they're here, right? And so there's a lot of considerations of, are you, achieving as much as you can in a reasonable way, right? And then, is the placement or the availability of a placement limited by their behavior? He's not allowed to work in that transition program environment because his self-injury is really significant, or his impulsivity is really significant. Or, she's having a challenge in terms of going into that classroom because of anxiety. And so, we have her in a different setting that's more restrictive. So thinking about, is the optimal environment for them limited by a behavior? And is it something that we can work on with therapies or medications or both? Okay, number 3, family functioning in the family or in the community. So again, are there impairments caused by the challenge in the family or the community? Is it causing significant conflict within the family or with siblings? So, for example, if there's a lot of impulsivity, right, play with siblings can be really challenging. If there's a lot of distractibility, then there can be, it takes forever to get out of the house. Everyone's fighting and yelling and screaming, and each morning is chaos. Sometimes there may be situations where it really limits their ability to engage in just family and community activities, right? Oh no, we can't go there because it's just too much sensory stimulation and she gets overwhelmed. Or I can't go there because I feel like it's too chaotic and I get overwhelmed, right? So really thinking all of these are applicable from young kids all the way up through adulthood in terms of just thinking about how different behaviors may be impacting you. And so really, and then also, always thinking about, obviously it's about the individual themselves, but thinking about the individual in the context of family functioning and how the family is engaging in the community and the environments. And sometimes that can help us gauge how much impairment it's really causing. We evoke, oh no, we don't have any problems at home. Everything's fine at home related to anxiety. However, we don't leave the house. Or we only go to this one certain place because if we go anywhere else, anxiety is really big. And so those situations, like even though it might not be causing big drama, it really is very limited and restrictive, and won't allow that individual or, really the family to access, the world that we live in all of its great things and opportunities. Okay, so that's functioning, and I've been talking a lot about behavior, but I want to think about, these all apply to learning disabilities, to speech delays, right? If we're thinking about this in terms of just language, right? Like how much is there challenge with language development causing conflicts or challenges in the family, or interactions at family events or social events or those types of things as well. Which really brings us also to number 4. And number 4 is one a lot of times parents and individuals don't necessarily always consider when they're considering or thinking about, starting therapies or thinking about medications in particular. So I think it's really important to think about how the behaviors or the symptoms may be causing challenges with social development and social interaction. This is one where, if there's language delays or communication difficulties, obviously you can see very closely, how those two are closely related to social interactions and social development. But the other pieces are like, let's say there's ADHD symptoms, impulsivity and attention span can affect social interactions and play and development of relationships with others, right? Someone who's really impulsive or grabbing toys away or, saying really unfiltered things may be considered annoying or not fun to play or interact with. Kids who have a short attention span and aren't really paying attention to their colleagues, aren't really paying attention to their peers, right? Or an adolescent who's like, not really engaging with that adolescent peer or with an adult, is not a fun play partner, is not a good friend, and may not be seen as a good student. And then that, or a good employee, right? And that affects, just the overall functioning in that relationship. And so thinking about, how those behaviors impact social relationships as well. There's also, I think, unfortunately, but definitely long-term memory in social group settings and a lot of groups that, kids who grow up together in the same neighborhood or public schools, she's the kid who, did this, he's the kid who did this, whatever the negative behavior was, and maybe, may have stemmed from impulsivity, may have stemmed from, places of anxiety too. It doesn't always mean that it stemmed from somewhere bad, but people remember those things. And we want to make sure we're setting kids and everyone up for success in that social world that they live in. Anxiety can be really impairing, right, in terms of building social relationships. There's less ability when you have a lot of anxiety to just engage in those social interactions and build those relationships. And then, that can be a cycle. If you're not as willing to engage and the relationships aren't as strong, then it makes it harder to continue with those relationships. So number 4 is the social development and social interaction. And then finally, number 5 is when the child, adolescent, or adult is expressing distress themselves about the situation. Why is this happening to me? I don't like that I have firecrackers in my head. I can't help it when I do that. I really try not to. I wish I wouldn't cry all the time. I wish I wouldn't have done that, really talking about, or I wish I could be able to do that. I really want to do this, but I can't because of anxiety, some other withdrawal type of challenge. So when we're hearing as parents, caretakers, peers, teachers, therapists, providers, all of those people that the individual themselves are distressed about the situation, then that's really important to think about how we can help. Okay, so those are the top 5. I think, we will take a lot of questions, but there's always this idea of considerations for starting any type of treatment, whether it's evaluation for therapy and speech, for behavioral or psychological therapies, for medication therapies. We always have to weigh the benefits and the risks and costs. And I think the easiest way to do this, and a really good way if you are going to a therapist or going to a medical provider to talk about starting treatments, that we kind of really outline these 4 areas. So what are the benefits of starting the treatment? That's obviously the easiest one. In terms of okay, we're trying to help these things. But then what are also the risks and the costs of starting the treatment? Going to therapy is going to be costly. It's going to take out a lot of time from other things. The medication may have side effects. So, those are some of the risks that go along with starting treatments. And then thinking about the benefits of not starting treatment, and there's always some things in here. Maybe he'll outgrow it on his own. We won't have to, suffer those risks or costs, right? If you're not actually doing the treatment. And then, but also thinking about the risks or costs to not treating, right? What are the consequences of not treating? Maybe we do end up in that crisis, or we end up with more challenges down the road. And so thinking about all of these things. And again, how important different things are to different people will be very different between individuals and families. But it is really important to I think, really, when you're talking to a provider, if you're seeking help or support for these things, or just considering it, going through these 4 boxes, here's the behavior, that we're worried about, and here's what where we're putting things in terms of the boxes. The other thing is that it's really important to work with and really try and delve into, why an individual is showing a certain behavior that's causing impairment, right? So whenever we see kids in clinic, we talk about target behaviors, what are we actually targeting with the treatment? There are some kids who might be running off, for example, because they're really impulsive. Well, that's very different than a kid who's running off because he's horrified or, panicking, right? And so running off itself is the behavior, but let's try and identify the symptom that we would actually treat. Are we going to work with therapy or medications to treat this part? Are we going to work with therapy and medications to treat, the anxiety part? So, and you can do this with all the different pieces, but it's always really important to think about those things as well. Okay, so again, top 5 is the behavior or symptom causing impairment in health and safety, academics, learning, work, social development, participation in the family and community, or if they're expressing distress and demonstrating distress themselves about the behavior. Okay, and then let's take questions.